Hey guys, all right, Kierkegaard, number 9. We're at now. So in this video, like the title page suggested, we're going to be talking about the pathetic, um, the existential pathos, the pathetic part of the pathetic dialectic, which makes up the religious sphere, which describes the religious sphere. So you've got those two aspects of the religious sphere, the pathetic and the dialectic, and we're going to look today at existential pathos, and included in that is suffering and guilt consciousness as well. So we'll hit all of those. Let's just have a quick look at that diagram to see where we are. So you can see there, I've highlighted, and we're in the religious sphere, the pathetic dialectic, and down the bottom there, existential pathos, so that's religiousness A, and I've also highlighted suffering and guilt consciousness. So in that diagram you can see I've separated suffering and guilt consciousness out from existential pathos. But although they really do belong together, it was kind of difficult making this diagram, actually, just figuring out where things could kind of best go, where things would fit most appropriately, because so many things were so interconnected, and this was one of the most difficult. So in the end, this is the way I've chosen to do it, because I wanted to connect particularly guilt consciousness and repentance with the metaphysical stuff that we talked about, because Kierkegaard does explicitly connect those, but they're also, like I said, connected to the religious. So I've got arrows in there to kind of to point out those connections, but yeah, and the suffering also is that's explicitly religious. There's that, I mean, suffering is religious suffering for Kierkegaard, but I've decided to group it with guilt and sin and repentance. They all just seemed kind of to go together, so I've put them all together. Although I think suffering maybe could have been put over in the religious sphere. Anyway, it's just kind of a guide and just a way to kind of to see all of Kierkegaard's thought in one page, just to kind of bring it all together and give the big picture in kind of one hit, as it were. So anyway, let's get into the first topic for the day, which is existential pathos, religiousness A. All right, so why are we talking about these? Why do we have these terms, pathetic dialectic? So the pathetic dialectic is the two parts that make up the religious sphere, and so the first part, religiousness A, or the existential pathos, that covers the thing we talked about, the idea we talked about in the last video, the absolute and the relative telos, and kind of the change that takes place within the individual, and also suffering and guilt consciousness. So they make up that existential pathos, half of that synthesis, you might say, and why Kierkegaard calls it pathos. It seems to me like pathos obviously is that the kind of emotions, especially things like I guess pity or sympathy, that are aroused in an audience to engage them, or to convince or persuade. And so it's often used in when we're talking about things like rhetoric and things. To me, it kind of fits in with this, because these things that we're discussing in this video today will be things like suffering, guilt. So these are not quite emotions, but like states of mind, or ways that almost emotional responses or reactions to things. So that's how I feel. That's how I make sense of Kierkegaard's calling this first Religiousness A pathos, existential pathos, and then the second part is dialectic. It's less clear why he chose that word, and even Kierkegaard says the existential pathos isn't undialectical. It's just not dialectical in the way that Religiousness B is. And we'll talk more about that later. But yeah, I think there's no point in spending too much time on the word. So anyway, existential pathos is where we are, also called Religiousness A. And the first point I would make here is that when it comes to possibility, so when we're talking about the aesthetic, word is the highest pathos, Kierkegaard says. And so in actuality, Jesus Christ. So in possibility, so this is the aesthetic realm, word is the highest pathos. And when we're moving into actuality, so this is the ethico-religious, ethical and the religious realms, deed is the highest. So we've got those two forms of pathos, word for the aesthetic and deed for the ethico-religious. So that just, it just orients us a little bit, I think, when as we move into trying to understand what Kierkegaard's getting at here with this pathos, this existential pathos. So aesthetically speaking, the poet or the author or the playwright is not changed by their production. They're not transformed within by their production. It doesn't affect them inwardly to the same degree, because the highest pathos is word, right? It's an external kind of medium directed outwards, if you like. So what matters most is the production itself, whether it's a play or a novel or a poem, whatever. The production is the important thing, and that's what generates the pathos. However, ethically speaking, the product is infinitely indifferent, and what matters most is the poet's own existence. So the person, the creator, whatever of whatever we're talking about, if we're on the ethico-religious level, then the most important thing is deed then. So what matters most is the poet or the person, the individual, him or herself. And I've got a quote which should throw some light on this. Ethically, the highest pathos is interested pathos, which is expressed in my actively transforming the whole of my existence in conformity with the object of the interest. Aesthetically, the highest pathos is disinterestedness. So, just extending what we were talking about before. Actually, let me just take that quote. Let me just work my way through that quote. So ethically, why are we talking about ethics? Aren't we talking about the religious? That might be the first question you have. Basically, these two, when we're talking about this material, the inwardness, they're both the same in the sense that they're both inward focused, but the religious relates to God, whereas the ethical relates to those universal principles. But for the purposes of existential pathos, Kierkegaard often talks about them together, so like the ethico-religious. So ethically and religiously, you could say, the highest pathos is interested pathos. So that's something which changes the individual, which affects the individual. That's what's more important than what is produced or what is displayed. And so it's all about the subject having that involvement or engagement with the idea, whether it be an ethical ideal or the God idea. On the other hand, aesthetically, the highest pathos is disinterestedness, because the author or the creator doesn't identify, if you like, with what they've produced. They're not. It's the production is separate from them. They're not trying to kind of embody the idea in the production through deed, through their actions, through their lives. They're just kind of throwing something out, and it's coming from them, but it's going outwards. It's an externally directed task. So there's a level of disinterest or separation from the individual in the production, which is not the case with the ethical and the religious. So I've got another quote as well, which which just adds some more to this. Aesthetic pathos does express itself in words and can, in its true form, signify that the individual abandons himself so as to lose himself in the idea, whereas existential pathos arises through the idea relating to the individual's existence in a reconstructive way. So here, let's just look through this. Aesthetic pathos does express itself in words and can signify the individual abandons himself so as to lose himself in the idea. So there's that element of disinterestedness. The individual abandons himself or herself and kind of gets lost in the idea itself. So there's no interest in the individual life, in the individual's life. It's an externally focused activity, whereas with the existential pathos, we have the idea. The idea relates to the individual's existence in a reconstructive way. So there's a transformative element to it, and it's intimately connected with the individual's existence. What have I written there? Aesthetic pathos carries one away from the individual to the idea. Existential pathos moves in the opposite direction, so that the idea, which will be the absolute telos, eternal happiness, transforms him or her absolutely. Yeah, and so this ties back in with what we talked about in the last video, where we relate to relative ends relatively, and to the absolute telos absolutely. So basically that's the idea here. Existential pathos transforms the individual. It's something that's inward focused, and it takes the idea and kind of brings it to life through the individual's actions, where deed, we saw, is the highest pathos, as opposed to the aesthetic, where we're more external. The focus is on the product itself, and through word is the highest form of pathos there. So that's the first part. That's the first part, and now I want to move on to suffering and guilt, and the Kierkegaard calls these two. Let's just move into the first the second part, which is suffering. All right, so suffering Well, so suffering is the essential expression, Kierkegaard calls it, and he also says suffering is dying to immediacy. So we'll look at that last expression a little bit later, why Kierkegaard calls it dying to immediacy. As for why he called it the essential expression, I think it's just the notion that this suffering is just crucial to the religious for Kierkegaard. It's not just crucial, it's what the religious is. The religious is suffering for Kierkegaard. So in that sense, it's not just something that you need in order to have the religious. It is the religious. So it's a kind of essential component in that way, that kind of literal way. So what is suffering? Well, we all know what suffering is, right? But Kierkegaard has a slightly different take on it, and just in a general, as a general aside, this is one of the reasons I like Kierkegaard, is because even though everything revolves around Christianity for him, and he seems to kind of buy into all of the stories, but he doesn't. He's not content with just accepting the reasons for them that have just been handed down kind of throughout Christian history. He wants to find what I would say, he wants to find a deeper, more authentic, more genuine meaning to them. So it's not just like suffering is like the devil makes you suffer, or the devil's influence, or because we're all so terrible sinful creatures, that's why we suffer. He's not content with those kinds of explanations. He wants to find something genuinely foundational, something that really goes to what it means to be a human, and that's why he's considered the father of existentialism, right? Because he really pushed for that, rather than kind of the more superficial, I would say superficial religious explanations. He wanted something more existential. There it is. So anyway, so what are we talking about here? In the aesthetic and the ethical spheres, suffering there is purely accidental. So in the religious, suffering is necessary, however, and it's a sign of inwardness. And the quote I have, the more the suffering, the more religious existence, and the suffering persists. While aesthetic existence is essentially enjoyment, and ethical existence essentially struggle and victory, religious existence is essentially suffering, and not as transitional, but persisting. And so there's the reason there why it's essential. It's what the religious is, in the same way that aesthetic existence is about enjoyment, ethical existence is about that struggle and victory. Religious is at its core suffering. And it's not just something that we go through and then we come out of. We never come out of it. It's continual. The suffering it's something that's with us for our entire lives. And essentially, I guess what Kierkegaard's saying is suffering in the aesthetic is a mistake. It's something that's gone awry. So we have to correct it. And with the ethical, it's more like a mark of progress or a transition. If there's suffering in the ethical, it means you're working towards a goal or something. You're working to overcome some situation. But when we're concerned with the religious, the absolute telos, relating to that absolute telos absolutely, then suffering it's what it means to be in that mode, in that sphere of existence. which is cool, which is maybe not cool, which is clear. So a bit more on, I want to talk a bit more about this idea of essential suffering, what exactly Kierkegaard's getting at here. So aesthetically, one endures this or that misfortune. Suffering arises in the aesthetic life, but it's kind of particular. We suffer this because of this or because of that. So it's kind of contingent, it's accidental. But once you get to the religious sphere of existence, then misfortune or suffering has to be grasped, sought after. It has to be embraced for itself. It becomes the not kind of something to be pushed aside or avoided, but that's the goal itself. That's suffering. And that, when you can embrace suffering in that way, that's when Kierkegaard, that's what Kierkegaard calls suffering essentially. It's like you've acknowledged, you've accepted that that life is suffering, but it's not just it's not really like the Buddhist approach there, where life is suffering, which is that would still be kind of aesthetic suffering for Kierkegaard. But for Buddhism, life is suffering means things are transient. You're never fully satisfied. Desire always pushes you on to more, which means you're always lacking. These kinds of ideas. So that's still an aesthetic form of suffering for Kierkegaard. The suffering that he's talking about is deeper than that. It goes more to the nature of what it means to be human, to exist in the first place. And I'll come back to that. I'll circle back to that idea a little bit later. Exactly what Kierkegaard's getting at when he says suffering. But I just want to keep going with this idea of essential, what it means to suffer essentially. And this quote should help. While someone who is immediate involuntarily disregards misfortune, and when it is no longer in evidence, does not know it is there, the religious individual has suffering constantly with him, demands suffering, just as the immediate individual demands good fortune, and demands and has suffering even when misfortune is externally absent. For it is not misfortune he demands, for then the relation would still be aesthetic, and he himself essentially undialectical in himself. So that's basically summing up what I've been getting at. For the religious, at the religious sphere, it's all about suffering. I just want to go through something at the end of that quote. He says the relation would still be aesthetic, and he himself essentially undialectical in himself. Just want to take a moment to break apart that idea there of being undialectical again. We have talked about it a little bit before, but I just want to flesh it out some more. So, first of all, the aesthetic has its dialectic outside the individual. So the dialectic, remember, was kind of the setting up of two opposites or counterpoints, or two forces at play. And as far as the aesthetic is concerned, the other point, the opposite, is outside the individual. It's external. Whereas with the ethical and the religious, it's inside. And if I can just go into a bit more detail with that. So Kierkegaard says if the individual is in himself undialectical, then he has his dialectic outside. So the individual himself is undialectic because the other force, or the opposite, the kind of what he's interacting with, or what he's operating in contrast to, or engaging him or herself with, is outside, is external, then that's the aesthetic interpretation. And in Stages on Life's Way, Kierkegaard, he's breaking down. He's talking about the story that he wrote, or the author is talking about the story that he wrote in the third essay of that book, and he's saying if it was an aesthetic play or an aesthetic piece of writing, the reason for the protagonist's suffering must be outside the individual. That's what would make the situation aesthetic. On the other hand, if the reason for the suffering is internal, so something to do with the individual, him or herself, then it's dialectical. The individual is dialectical. That opposing force has kind of been brought inside, into the individual. So non-aesthetic suffering is always based on an idea. And so just to flesh that out regarding the ethical and the religious, if the individual is dialectical in himself, inwardly in self-assertion, so the self is kind of the basis being used to overcome the problem and assert itself in some way. This is what the ethical interpretation is. This is on the ethical level. So it's the individual working to manifest some kind of a universal or general ethical principle, a guideline. Then that's an ethical. We're at the ethical level. The individual is dialectical, but it's at the ethical level because the self is intact and involved. The religiousness A, however, is the individual is obviously dialectical, but dialectically defined inwardly in self-annihilation before God. So the self kind of takes a back seat. The self reduces in importance, and that's what makes the difference between religiousness A and the ethical. And then he goes on to say that if the individual is paradox dialectical, then we are at religiousness B, and I'll talk more about that in the next video. But so anyway, so that's just to get back to that quote. The misfortune comes to someone in the aesthetic realm, then it's always contingent, it's always accidental, it's always something that the individual wants to avoid. For the religious sphere, they need that suffering. The suffering is intrinsic to the individual's existence, and that's what makes the individual and the religious individual dialectical in themselves, as opposed to the aesthetic individual who is undialectical in him or herself. So hopefully that clears that up, because it is confusing the way Kierkegaard uses it, and he does use that word quite a lot, dialectic, dialectical. So yeah. All right, so let's move on to suffering. Why suffering? Why is suffering so crucial here? And the reason is that suffering is always religious. It's always religious suffering. I think I've mentioned that at the beginning. And we can kind of make the distinction a little bit by saying that misfortune is more kind of the aesthetic or even the ethical, but suffering, genuine suffering, that's religious. And so suffering is always concerned with the God relationship, the relationship the individual has to God. And my quote: "This suffering has its basis in the fact that, strictly speaking, in his immediacy, the individual is inside relative ends absolutely. Its meaning is the inversion of the relation, dying to immediacy. or expressing in existing that the individual himself can do nothing at all, but is nothing before God. So we need to have a bit of a breakdown of this quote. So the reason that suffering arises here then is basically because the individual it's a kind of a coalescing of the infinite with the finite. That's what the individual is. That's what causes the suffering. That's what suffering is here. It's that breaking or that tension or the contradiction between the individual who is infinite and their concrete existence as a finite subject, as a living being. So in that brings us into this. We're back at that tension then between the finite and the infinite, between the absolute and the relative, and so suffering then requires, the religious requires that one relinquish that immediacy, let go of it. Not completely, because we don't want to go the monastic route where we lose the relative altogether. We need to keep that, but we just need to keep it in perspective. And Kierkegaard calls that dying to immediacy, the inversion of the relation. So we're no longer completely focused on our finitude, on our finite goals, on our relative ends. Now we need to switch the focus to the absolute, and that's this process of dying to immediacy, and that's what suffering is. That's what causes suffering. It's that the break that we have to enact to turn our attention to the absolute as opposed to the relative. And he also says here, he's also got the idea that the individual can do nothing at all and is nothing before God. And this ties back in with what I said a moment ago when we were talking about the dialectical. There's this element of self-annihilation there, because one sees oneself before God, and obviously God is perfect in every way, and we are nothing before that. We don't even compare. And so that is there's suffering again involved in that, right? We this whole situation, living in the religious, it creates so much suffering. It's what it means to live in the religious. So, okay, shall I summarize that? Let me just see if I can. Actually, let me keep going, and then we'll try and bring it together at the end. So I've got another quote here. Religiously, the task is to grasp that one is nothing at all before God, or to be nothing at all, and be thereby before God. So that's just kind of reinforcing that notion. Again, like I said, Kierkegaard is wholly in on Christianity. God is he's the big kahuna. It's like there's so we've gone fully off the religious end of the scale here. But he says that few people actually believe this. Many people say it, many people acknowledge it, but few people actually live it. And that goes back to that aesthetic and the religious distinction when we're talking about pathos. The aesthetic is word, the highest pathos is word, whereas for the religious, the highest pathos is deed. Many people can say, yeah, I'm nothing before God, but when it comes to actually acting as if you really are nothing before God, that's where people that separates the wheat from the chaff, right? And so that's why Kierkegaard calls this task suffering. And my quote, bringing the absoluteness of the religious together with the particular, which together in existence is the very basis and meaning of the suffering. So yeah, again, just that idea that the coalescing, the merging of the absolute and the particular in existence. So bringing those two dimensions or aspects together in a concrete existence, the meaning of that is suffering. And I guess we could perhaps make it even a little bit clearer. The suffering arises first of all maybe from the fact of dying to immediacy, when you have to let go of that immediate realm, that aesthetic realm, which is characterized by enjoyment, when you have to not completely eliminate it, but kind of, like I said, turn your attention away from it. That dying to immediacy, there's suffering involved in that. Also, when you have to acknowledge and live the truth that you're nothing before God, there's suffering involved in that. And you can't do anything without God. More suffering involved there. And just the fact of kind of constraining yourself as an infinite, your infinite aspect, the absolute telos that you're striving towards is something far greater than the finite existence which you live in. And so that having to kind of operate within this finite restrictions, but orient yourself to something infinite, something absolute, suffering in that. So all of these different ways of suffering, they show up, they manifest in the religious human life. So it's not like, again, it's not like these are things you can avoid. It's just what it means to exist for a human being religiously. And he, in a nice twist, he says that the task of religion is not to make life easier, but harder. This is another way of saying suffering is essential, right? We have to live our lives keeping in mind that God relationship and all that it entails, that we're nothing before God. We can't do anything without Him. We have to be completely oriented towards that. That has to we have to express that relationship through every action, through every deed that we do. And so I thought that's a really cool. as much, I mean, it's religious, so I can't get on board with it that much. But still, that idea, the task of religion is not to make life easier but harder. You never hear that said in church, right? So I mean, that's why Kierkegaard was so at odds with the church and with other priests and so on, because he's saying the exact opposite basically to what they're saying. No one says religion is about making life harder, but this is existentialism, man. Life is hard, and we're not afraid to kind of call it like it is. It's not all rainbows and I don't know what else is rainbows and puppy dogs or whatever the expression is. This is hard stuff, and Kierkegaard's clear about it. It's not an easy road, and if you want an easy road, you're not going to find it in the religious. You're better off going back to the aesthetic. You're better off chasing finite desires. That's going to be easier in the end. And the other point there, which I mentioned as well, is that we have to keep in mind the God relationship in everything we do. So that I like that as well. That idea that you've got something to kind of focus your life, something to you carry with you all the time, and it's even when you're engaged in meeting relative ends, finishing this project at work, or picking up the kids. I think I've used that before, or whatever it might be. Making this much money, buying that house, getting this car, whatever small relative ends we're talking about. You've always got that absolute goal behind you, which is orienting your life, which is giving you some meaning and direction and focus. That's nice. It's just a shame that Kierkegaard placed it in God, but I think there's we can secularize that. There can still be something that we orient our lives around, that we build our lives around, that is not necessarily a transcendent being, alleged transcendent being. Okay, so anyway, that's suffering, and let's move on to guilt consciousness. Alright, so guilt consciousness, same idea here as with suffering. We know what guilt is, you'd think, but obviously Kierkegaard's going to do something with it that you probably wouldn't have expected. Excuse me. So I've found like 3 different kind of formulations of guilt that Kierkegaard presents or outlines throughout the different places and different books. So I'm going to take each of them separately. Like I said, there are 3. The first one I'm calling the metaphysical formulation. So this is tied in. It's in the concept of anxiety, and it's tied in with all of the way that we, if you remember, way back at the beginning of the series, we talked about the way that spirit posits itself in that synthesis of the psychical and the physical. So anyway, you've got that situation where kind of there's that innocent spirit. It's not yet fully spirit, but then when it posits itself, it apprehends that nothing of possibility, and it's at that point that the synthesis, it posits itself in the synthesis of those 2, the psychical and the physical, in spirit. But because that whole process takes place through the freedom that one is, it takes place in freedom. It's not forced upon the individual. Because it takes place in freedom, which is that anxious possibility of being able, which precedes possibility itself. Since this whole thing happens through freedom, then the spirit which posited it is guilty. And it's guilty because it freely kind of apprehended, it freely posited itself and became spirit. Now this is only this can only really be guilt if you adopt the view, which Kierkegaard does, that non-being or possibility is bad. And if you remember, I talked about that in one of those earlier videos that for Kierkegaard possibility is bad. It's kind of a negative situation, and we want to move towards actuality, and that was what becoming was all about. So possibility is bad. It arouses anxiety, and if you remember in stages, Kierkegaard has a parable in which just the possibility that this guy fathered a child unintentionally, just that possibility, he wasn't sure, he didn't even know if it was true, but just the possibility that he'd fathered a child that he had no part in raising, that drove him insane. So all through Kierkegaard is this underlying tone that non-being, that possibility is bad, and we want to, and it's with the aesthetic, we saw it too, right? The aesthetic is characterized by the possible. It's the ethical and the religious, where actuality takes precedence. So in that sense, that initial positing of the self, in that it posits itself through possibility, through the apprehension of possibility, and it does that as a freedom, it's a free act, then the self, the spirit, is guilty. And just to continue on with that theme, so we saw that, again, back in those early videos, anxiety is about nothing, which was the same thing as possibility. Non-being turned out to be the being of possibility. And since our guilt stems from that nothing, that possibility, that's the reason why we're guilty, is because we apprehended that possibility. And because that possibility is kind of connected with anxiety, then we're also anxious about guilt. So we're anxious about our guilt. And what we need to do to cancel that, the relation that we have of anxiety to our guilt, is to posit a relation to guilt that is actual. So in order to overcome this anxiety we feel over our guilt, we need to posit a relation. We need to come to a relation with that guilt which is actual. We need to actualize it in some way. Again, just drawing on that idea of the deed being the important thing in the religious sphere, actuality being taking precedent over possibility. However, once guilt is posited in this way, as a kind of an actual occurrence, something that we kind of own, then the anxiety doesn't disappear. Remember, anxiety is an ever-present feature of human existence, but it's avoided through this, and it's replaced eventually by repentance, which we'll talk about later. But the important point in that little rambling story I gave you is the positing of guilt. So it's taking the relation of anxiety we have to guilt and positing it in a relation that's actual. By that I mean just kind of acknowledging, accepting, not trying to dodge that relation, not trying to dodge our guilt, owning it, making it actual. That's what I mean when I say positing a relation to our guilt that's actual. It's just kind of acknowledging, accepting, embracing our guilt. And it's this which is guilt consciousness. So this is the important point. It's not, the point that Kierkegaard's making is not so much that we're guilty. He explained how we're guilty through the self positing itself way back in the metaphysical part of things. But in order to deal with that in the religious sphere, to move forward in the religious sphere, we need to adopt this guilt consciousness. We need to acknowledge our guilt and embrace it. And it's only then that we move forward. So the important point is not that we're guilty. We are guilty. The important point is to embrace it, to be conscious of it. So just as I've got a little summary here. So the human opens him or herself to possibility in order to be human, and that's the spirit positing itself in that synthesis. But because the possible is negative or bad, and this is something I didn't mention, I would imagine that Kierkegaard sees that as that's how he would explain the fall in Christianity, in Christian terms. So that would be his fall, I think, there, where when we actually become human, we apprehend our possibilities and we enter this kind of finite world with all that comes with it. And so, because of all that, becoming a human being confers guilt. And what we need to do, the task, is to acknowledge that, embrace it, become a guilt consciousness. Let guilt consciousness kind of define our deeds. That's where all of this is going, right? It's all going back to deed. It's not that it's not enough to kind of acknowledge suffering. We have to embody that through the things we do. It's not enough to be guilty or to even know that we're guilty. We have to make that the center point of our existence. We have to embody that guilt consciousness, and that's the important thing for Kierkegaard. It's always inward. It's always going within to that subjectivity. So this point here about the spirit positing itself and it's that leads to guilt, it's kind of actually secular, I think. There's nothing explicitly religious here. You can the terms maybe things like spirit, but even that you can kind of massage that away, I think, and somehow a human individual becomes conscious at some point, and it's really that he's talking about when we become self-aware or conscious, self-conscious. That's what he's really describing here, and there's nothing necessarily religious about that, as long as you accept that kind of the possibilities that entering that come along with kind of self-awareness, the possibilities you become aware of, and then you kind of have some responsibility over. That has to be seen as negative in order for this idea of guilt to go through. But if you can do that, and I think there is a reasonable argument for that too, this is not necessarily a religious claim, although it's obviously motivated by religion for Kierkegaard, and in that sense it is a form of kind of Christian apologetics, right? He's trying to explain guilt, but he's trying to do it in a way that's not kind of childish even, I would say. You're guilty because Adam sinned and guilt passes through to every whatever, or you're guilty because you've sinned against God. We all have something like that. These are not notions that Kierkegaard tends to trade in. He's looking deeper, something at the core of what it means to be a human, and in doing that, he's finding something existential, not something religious, which is good, and that's why he's interesting to me, at least. So that was the first one, the metaphysical formulation. He also has what I've called the existential formulation, and this is from either or, And I've just got I've just got one line here. It's not even a quote, but he says, "I'm guilty in choosing myself without having created myself." So this is kind of like we choose ourselves. We kind of take responsibility for ourselves. We accept our actions as our own, as if we are the agents or the cause or the subject behind them. But we haven't created ourselves in the first place, so we're kind of unjustified in that way. And that's also an interesting way to think about guilt. And again, in a sense, and it's again totally secular, but the way that we treat ourselves, we see ourselves and present ourselves as an independent subject responsible for our own actions, but we haven't created ourselves. We're not responsible for that. We're thrown into the world, as Heidegger says. So in that sense, there is kind of, we're in the wrong, at least in a little way, in some aspect, in some respect. We're kind of taking possession of something that we had no original role in creating. So there is a way, I think, you can see guilt in that, and that's exactly what Heidegger says too. Heidegger's notion of guilt is being the null ground of a nullity, he says, which is basically the same thing, being the ground of a nullity. We through us, negation comes about through the different possibilities that we reject. So we're the source of this negative force, if you like, that comes into the world through us. And in that sense, for Heidegger, we're guilty. And on top of that, we're the null ground of a nullity. We have no, and this is back to the Kierkegaard part. We didn't create ourselves. We're the null ground. We had no original. It wasn't our decision to exist, and that's what makes us a null ground. So we're kind of guilty, kind of twice, if you like. And Sartre says something similar, but he shifts it to so that we're guilty under the look of the other. So the other looks at us, and in doing so makes us an object. And even though that's happened, the other has kind of taken possession of us, we still have to assume responsibility for ourselves as subjects, even though the other has kind of defined us as an object, kind of owns us in that way. So again, there's that idea, we're responsible for ourselves without having created ourselves. So you can see how this flows through, this idea of Kierkegaard's. And so that's the second type of guilt, or way that Kierkegaard expresses or describes guilt. The last way I've called the religious formulation. And so this is from the postscript. And the way this one works is, he says, guilt arises because the individual is a concrete existence in time. And even while deliberating, the individual is ethically responsible for their use of time. So we're a concrete existence in time, and we're responsible for how we use that time, for what we do with that time. But what happens is this: I grasp the task. We grasp the task, the religious task, relating to the absolute telos, absolutely, and prepare to begin. So Kierkegaard's laid the task out for us. We've thought about it, we understand it, and now we're ready to embark on this on this life in the religious sphere. But in grasping the task, we have to grasp it in its totality, right? We have to understand the task completely, as if it's complete, as if it's a complete thing that's presented before us. And this can only be done by abstracting the task from a lived, genuine, concrete existence, right? So we have to abstract that task in order to grasp it in its totality. But that means that because the task precisely is to not abstract stuff. The task is to live concretely, to exist, to become in as a living, active subject, right? But when we step back, we reflect, we abstract out, then that very act is contradicting what we wanted to do, which is to live in this concrete existence, to live this concrete existence as a subject, as an individual, existing here and now. And so even before we begin the task of existence, we've already gone astray and have to begin again. And of course there's no way out of this circle, right? Because you can't have the task in mind without abstracting from it, without abstracting from a concrete existence. And so the task can only begin after we're already guilty of having broken, of having failed to live up to that task. So it's a little bit I don't know. It's definitely abstract, but it's hard to kind of put that maybe into terms that we could accept. But there is kind of something to it, and there is a deeper truth, I think, here, which is that the paradox, the contradiction that arises for a concrete individual living to try and living in the finite, to try and embrace this absolute infinite telos. And that's basically what it goes back to, that tension between the finite and the infinite. And it's because of that, ultimately, that we're guilty. And that again, that's a tension that we can't get rid of just by virtue of being human. So that's the religious formulation. Now, a couple of things a couple more points I have. The first one is, why is guilt consciousness unavoidable? And I just wanted to stress this. I think we've already kind of answered it. Being human means existing concretely, finitely, amidst possibility, and with the incompleteness of becoming. That's what it means to be human. But one way or another, this concrete existence confers guilt on us. And I gave you 3 ways there. Through the possibility, from when the self posits itself, when we become kind of conscious or self-aware, however you want to phrase it, or when we choose ourselves without having created ourselves, so we're unjustified in that way, or whether it's through this abstraction. We can't avoid abstracting, thinking, that kind of reasoning, reflection. We can't avoid doing that, and yet that's the very thing which pulls us out of the absolute task before us. So there's just no way. It's just what it means to be human, is to be guilty. And the other thing I wanted to mention is the qualitative nature here of guilt. So guilt is not quantitative, and we've talked about that distinction before. so quantitative meaning like you can just kind of it's like cumulative. You can add up, or it's a progression that you can track and follow. Qualitative is the opposite of that. So it's just there is no progression from this point to this point. It's like an immediate transition, and that's what Kierkegaard's saying here, that guilt is qualitative in that way. It's not quantitative. So we can't count up individual actions and derive guilt from them, or we can't look at what things you've done and say, okay, well, you're not guilty there, so that was good, or you're not guilty there. This one, you might have been guilty there, so that's one against you. It doesn't work like that. Guilt doesn't work like that. Even a single guilt, as soon as God is posited, stands in relation to the absolute, eternal happiness. It's lifted into the infinite. I wrote here, it's basically raised to the infinite power. That's what this, when we enter this relation with the absolute, that's what it does. It takes everything we do and lifts it to that higher plane where we're dealing with things like eternity, infinite, absolute. There's no more finitude involved. It's no longer just this or that. It's now everything for all of time. And he's criticizing the idea that one can be guilty in this or that. And he says, guilty in this or that, and then for 8 days, guiltless. But then on the 9th day, something goes wrong again, and he's guilty again. So he's ridiculing that idea that guilt is it's quantitative, that it's something we can tally up, we can assess, calculate in that way. It's qualitative because as soon as you're guilty through and through, for all time, for all eternity, and there's no getting out of it. You're not a little bit guilty, you weren't guilty on that day but not on that day. You're absolutely guilty, infinitely guilty. And that, again, that's just because guilt is it's ontological. It applies to existence, not to the ontic. To go Heidegger, to throw some Heideggerian terms in there. And he's also criticizing the Middle Age concept of penance, where you're guilty for whatever you committed, some sin or something, and you can kind of absolve yourself of that sin through penance. That's a quantitative way of thinking about it. And so, obviously, you can't say a few Hail Marys and cleanse yourself. That's not going to deal with guilt as Kierkegaard sees it. Again, it's kind of a childish notion, isn't it? You did something wrong, say you're sorry, and then it goes away. That's I don't want to be too critical of Christianity. I've been pretty critical of that in other places, but yeah, it's just not deep enough here. Kierkegaard's getting deeper than that. So I've got a quote: "Those who learn to know their guilt only from the finite are lost in the finite. The person who learns to know guilt only by analogy to judgments of the police court and the Supreme Court never really understands that he is guilty. For if a person is guilty, the guilt is infinite." And that's basically what I was saying. It's infinite because, it's infinite, I guess, for two reasons there, maybe. It's infinite because it's related to the absolute, to God. So it's being raised to the infinite power. But it's also infinite because it's, or maybe it's not infinite in this sense, but it's something you can't avoid for it throughout your life, because it's part of what makes you a human being. It's part of existence. It's ontological. So maybe there are two ways there. that guilt is unavoidable. It's infinite because it's been raised to the infinite power through us relating to God, to the absolute. But it's also unavoidable because it's what it means to be human. To be human is to have kind of brought possibility to light, brought possibility into the world, brought a negativity into the world, or to assume responsibility for oneself, even though one's not the creator of oneself, for those kind of reasons. So the guilt is with you, not infinitely, because you're not infinite in that sense, but at least throughout your entire life. There's no way you can be a human and not be guilty. That's the point. So there's those two ways of thinking about it, I guess. So that's kind of bringing me to an end. Finally, this video is quite long, I think. So the whole thing was very much religiously oriented, right? It's very focused on the religious, but I do think it's secularizable, like I said, concerning, I think, suffering. And it's not even that we have to work that hard. Kierkegaard's done much of the work for us. He's by drilling down and kind of getting to the level of ontology, to the level of existence, to being. He's done the hard work, much of the hard work for us. Although, like I said, obviously he was motivated by Christian apologetics. He wanted to explain these terms, but he didn't want to kind of give a superficial explanation. You're guilty because you broke God's commandments. He wants something more than that. That's like an accidental. It's like a mistake. That kind of guilt. So he went deeper, and in doing that, he gave, I think, many of the existentialists who came later kind of a foundation to go from. And just to look at some of those, first of all, we talked about the relative ends and the absolute end. That we can secularize that because we can this idea of building one's life around a central idea, keeping that central idea in mind all the time, even when you're doing other things. That's a nice idea. And the idea, though, that we're talking about here won't be a finite goal. It won't be to make a lot of money, so it's not like a self-helpy kind of approach here. Be all that you can be, get a new car, or get this job, or get this degree, or whatever. It's not going to be anything like that. It's going to be something that applies to your to your foundation, to your very existence. It's going to be something ontological, something that you can, that gives some meaning to your life. And of course these things like the relative ends, as Kierkegaard calls them, won't do that. They won't suffice. But we can get there without kind of resorting to the idea of a transcendent God. Same with suffering. I mentioned briefly it crops up in Buddhism. Right? Life is suffering for Buddhists. And you can build a philosophy around that that doesn't necessarily include God. That doesn't include religion even. And again, Kierkegaard does it too, with this idea that it's just what it means to suffer. We're kind of a free transcendence, trapped in a finite existence. Even that alone, nothing religious about that, but that alone gives us a grounding for a secular version of the claim that life is suffering, And guilt. same thing there. We saw that with Heidegger and Sartre. They both took that and made it nothing to do with religion or God or anything like that, or even a relation to a God idea. It's all relevant, even without those religious bells and whistles. Okay, so let's have a quick look at a summary. So this video we talked about existential pathos, or religiousness A. There are basically three parts to this. The first part was relating to relative ends relatively and the absolute telos, or the absolute end, absolutely. We talked about that mainly in the last video, but the basic idea there, the absolute telos, transforms the individual absolutely. The second thing we looked at was the essential expression of the religious, which was suffering. And this was contrasted with aesthetic misfortune and the ethical struggle and victory of a self. Suffering for Kierkegaard must become essential. It must be something that is sought after for itself. It's not some kind of incidental accompaniment to your life. It's what your existence is. It has to be that central. Suffering is therefore always religious for Kierkegaard, and it always involves self-annihilation before God. We talked about dying to immediacy, where you have to turn away from the finite and kind of make the absolute, make that the center point of your existence. And we also talked about the way suffering is essentially it's the bringing of the absolute and of the religious together with the particular. It's the finite and the infinite again, something that we've seen many times, right? And the third part was the decisive expression, guilt consciousness. I didn't talk about why it being the decisive expression, but yeah, Kierkegaard does describe it as the decisive expression. Probably, I mean, not that important. And we looked at, there are three different kind of ways that Kierkegaard talks about guilt, in at least the books that I've read, what I call the metaphysical formulation, the existential formulation, and the religious formulation. Kierkegaard doesn't call them by those names, by the way. So don't, those are just what I've decided to call them. And reading through the different books, I found those three different ways that Kierkegaard talks about guilt, and gave them a name. So that's not Kierkegaard original. We also have to become conscious of our guilt. That was the important part. Positing our guilt actually for ourselves, not just being guilty, which we all are. We have to actually acknowledge that, posit it for ourselves. So guilt is unavoidable. It's not something you can sidestep, or no matter how good you are, you can't avoid guilt. And it arises, or in relation to the absolute, guilt is qualitative, therefore infinite. And we talked about that, like raising guilt. The relation to the absolute, raising everything to the infinite power. And so, and that again, that's not from Kierkegaard. So don't think that I'm, don't just. That's my own little contribution. So don't, if you think, well, that's a funny way to put it, that's because it's the way I'm putting it, not the way Kierkegaard put it. So anyway, yeah, so that's what we've covered in this video. I think this is going to be a long one. It's hard to tell because I've made so many mistakes along the way, and I've had to break it up. I've had to stop and restart, and this has been a tough video to film. Anyway, let's finish there. Next video we'll look at something, probably religiousness B. We'll look at the dialectic half of the religious sphere. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.